Thank you, Keith, for the introduction, and also colleagues for organising this meeting and giving me an opportunity to give, a really brief overview to GMP. When I was asked to give this presentation within 20-25 minutes on GMP issues, it's almost impossible to cover such a wide topic, but I will try and point you in the right direction. And of course, we're always available for any questions or answers or follow-up emails. So basically, as I said, this will be quite a brief presentation. Really just introduce you to what the GMPs are and why do we have the GMPs. I guess really what it means for a small or a medium enterprise. And I guess it links back to Keith's presentation also as well, when you looked at those major objections in relation to the submissions. A lot of the quality related major objections were in the GMP area. So it's important to remember that when you are manufacturing, that this can have an impact down the line if things change or you do not control that change. A little bit about supply chain management, and then once again reference to the investigational medicinal products and clinical trials, and a small piece on the qualified person. And then at the end I have maybe two slides which are really possibly the key take-home message from the presentation. So GMP, what it's not, I guess, from an inspector's point of view, we always know that GMP stands for good manufacturing practice. A lot of the companies that we regulate certainly reference the great mounds of paper that we seem to request companies to have, and that also seems to then go across to our assessment colleagues who require an awful lot of documentation from you. But really, the technical term, I guess, is GMP shall mean that part of quality assurance which ensures that products are consistently produced and controlled to quality standards appropriate to their intended use. So essentially that any manufacturer, no matter what the size, and remember, we've got these GMP guidelines which really apply to any size of manufacturer. And that can be very complicated for small companies because you're being compared to the same requirements as large pharmaceutical companies. But essentially it means that you define how you're going to manufacture a product and then be able to demonstrate that you can consistently produce that product to that defined specification. So I guess GMP, or good manufacturing practice, is not a like to have. It essentially is a legal requirement. It's a must have. And we have a number of directives, once again, more documentation or debt by directives. We have a lot of directives or law in this area. Directive 2001-83 and Directive 2001-82 apply to human medicines and veterinary medicines respectively. And they have specific reference in these directives to essentially manufacture that member states and medicinal product competent authorities have to take all appropriate measures to ensure that the manufacture of medicines on their territory are subject to holding an authorization, and that authorization we call our Manufacturing Importation Authorization, or MIA. And the same reference is also in the veterinary directive as well. Now these directives reference GMP, but also then give they also outline the requirements for placing a product on the market within the EU. They also give reference to QP requirements, packaging and labeling requirements, the classification of medicinal products, wholesale and distribution, and then advertising and pharmacovigilance requirements for those medicines. So these are really the kind of overarching directives for medicinal products in the EEA. And then to compound the issue, we have two specific, I guess, directives in relation to manufacturing. And these are Directive 2003-94, which is for human medicines, and 91/41/2 for medicines for veterinary usages. These are quite short directives, and as is the nature of this business, they are quite open to interpretation. So then that has necessitated the development of what we could call the Good Manufacturing Practice Guidelines, or the GMPs. And these really are the detailed guidance documents that are used by member states when they're inspecting and authorizing sites that are manufacturing medicinal products. And I'll see if I can open this link. Okay, so this link is in the presentation for follow-up, and essentially it links to the European Commission's website. Sorry, I can't seem to scroll down. And essentially, in the introduction, you can see the legislation or the directives requiring GMP to be put in place. And then the documents are broken up into three parts. Part one is the basic requirements for medicinal products, which really outline a lot of the key quality system components that need to be in place within any manufacturer of a medicinal product. And part one has 9 chapters. Part two, once again, outlines the basic requirements for active substances used as starting materials in medicinal products. And part three are some general GMP-related documents, such as the site master file, quality risk management, Q9 and Q10, and then batch certification. And then we have the annexes, which essentially are building on those part one documents, which give specific guidance for different types of medicines that are manufactured. And we have Annex 1 and Annex 2, Annex 1 for sterile products, Annex 2 for biological, Annex 4 for veterinary. And then there's also some general guidance in Annex 13 for manufacture of IMPs, or investigational medicinal products. And then we also have Annex 16, which is certification by a qualified person, and batch release. And I'll come back a little bit more to the role of the qualified person. So just a summary, we have 9 basic chapters in part one, 9 chapters in part one. We have, I guess, 1 chapter on the requirements for active substances, but this is 49 pages long. We have part 3, which have the 5 GMP-related documents and some of them from ICH. And then we have 19, I guess, specific annexes. So there's quite a lot of guidance that we have in place for manufacturers. So the next number of slides are really just to highlight key areas, I guess, of quality systems or of facilities that need to be taken into consideration when you're going to manufacture medicinal products for human or veterinary use. And as I said earlier, these requirements apply to pharma of all sizes, university-based manufacturers, and I guess hospital-based manufacturers. So one of the key areas that we see, I guess, starting off is, how you design your facility, or what is the requirements for the facility. Many small enterprises start up with essentially develop a facility without an idea of what type of products they're going to manufacture in the future. So that can often have a big impact in terms of, identifying what products you want to manufacture, and then ensuring that you design a facility that facilitates the manufacture of that product. So in any facility design for medicinal products, your inspectors will look at the process flows for staff within the facility, the flows of equipment, materials, and reagents, and of course how product and waste cross over or interact during the manufacturing process. Depending on the type of medicine that you're making, there may be certain air quality requirements or environmental monitoring that needs to be performed that you need to be aware of, and also differential pressures in the different rooms where you're doing different classes of manufacture. So essentially the legislation requires manufacturers to have a facility that's fit for purpose. Just referring back then to the reagents and materials, and often this can link back to early stage manufacturing of your investigational medicinal product for a clinical trial, that essentially these are defined early on in the process, and that they are certainly fit for purpose, that if possible, no laboratory or reagent grade reagents or materials should be used in the manufacture of any sort of medicine. That the reagents or materials used are qualified for use, and that you have good control over the quality of any of those reagents or materials that you intend to use, and that you've got a very good and robust system for accepting new batches of these reagents in, and the capability of picking up changes to these reagents and materials that may have subsequent impact on the medicine that you're trying to manufacture. So just referring back to documentation, so we expect, I guess, that you have your processes defined, and then you also need to have your procedures and, around that defined as well. Appropriate forms and documentation and means for recording data to just demonstrate consistency with defined processes and procedures. And once again, to have overall control of your documentation and being able to demonstrate that to the inspection team. One of the areas that we see, I guess, a number of issues for small and medium enterprises is personnel. There is a need to have an adequate number of staff. The GMP do have some staff defined in legislation that are expected to be in place, such as a head of production, a head of quality assurance, and as I talked about previously, the qualified person. It does outline that these staff need to be adequately trained. One of the big areas that we see in small enterprises is staff retention. That if it's a small organization and you're reliant on a small number of people, they tend to be quite mobile, and their specialization is quite mobile, and there tends to be a lot of cross movement between organizations. So if you lose one or two key personnel, that can set your application for manufacturing back quite a long way. And when that kind of corporate or business knowledge walks out the door. So it's important that you try and retain those staff, or at least have a system that there's kind of backups for key members of staff, and that you're not suffering from that loss of knowledge. The quality system, the key parts of the quality system that are important to try and have established early, I guess, in your road to manufacturing a medicinal product is essentially management of change or change control. And this has also been alluded to by the previous speaker, that if things do have to change in the manufacturing process, that they are very transparently managed, and that the rationale for that change is very well documented, and that you always keep in mind the potential to impact the medicine that you're manufacturing, which could have a safety concern or an efficacy concern for the patient. Management of deviations or non-conformances or process improvements, depending on which way you want to call them. Things occur during the course of manufacturing. As soon as you have any person involved in a process, it's very natural to error. It's not expected that, that mistakes won't happen in a manufacturing facility of any size. So really then the inspection team want to see how you're managing those deviations, how you investigate them, how you review them, how you, put in place appropriate corrective actions that correct the issue as quickly as possible, and then preventive actions which may take a longer time to implement, but we also need to see how that's managed. And then management of complaints comes a little bit later, when you've maybe got medicines on the market, in terms of how you get information back about the marketplace, or also manage complaints from suppliers, or also manage complaints internally from staff members, because they can give you very valuable information about the quality system and how the quality system is defined within the manufacturing facility. So a little bit about supply chain management. The expectation of any inspection team walking into a facility is that for any of the key critical suppliers or entities that you do interact with, that there are contracts in place. And there's detailed guidance in relation to contracts in Chapter 7 of the EU GMPs. That if you do enter into an arrangement with a third party that there's some sort of approval process, and how do you approve that supplier to supply you with materials or reagents or starting or active substance. And the expectation is that there's some level of audit performed by the manufacturer. How you control deliveries and how you accept deliveries of new batches of materials from that supplier, and how you ensure that, I guess, that quality is maintained during your ongoing interaction with the supplier. For small, medium enterprises, maybe one of the things to assess is the resilience of the supply. If you're dealing with other small organizations or smaller manufacturers, I guess their ability to continue to provide you with the critical reagents and materials that you're purchasing from them, if they go out of business and you're looking for another supplier when you're fairly advanced in your clinical trial or your IMP submission, then that can have major impacts on the process of getting the authorization. So I guess to have it maybe approve a number of suppliers for critical materials, certainly risk assess the supply chain for any of those real critical materials or reagents or supplies that will essentially ensure that you can consistently manufacture your own product. And then I guess assess the impact of any change of a supplier or change that a batch of a raw material or reagent may have on the product, and whether that will affect the bioequivalence or the product from batch to batch. So a little bit about investigational medicinal products and clinical trials. And this just links to some, I guess, key legislative references. As I stated, there's a dedicated annex in the guideline, Annex 13. There is a requirement, just because you're manufacturing an investigational medicinal product, it doesn't, I guess, exempt you from the need to manufacture in compliance with GMP. Annex 13 describes the release of batches by the QP, and the batch certification requirement is defined in this annex. And then we have the detailed clinical trial information, as already alluded to by the previous speaker, on EMA and the European Commission's website. The qualified person, this is a very specific person defined in legislation. I guess this is the person that your competent authority or your inspectorates interacts with during the course of an inspection. It is the person that, I guess, the legislation hopes to protect, but also it's the person that, if something does go wrong during the manufacture, it is the person that takes the full responsibility if something goes wrong with that medicine on the marketplace. So the legislative reference is in Article 48 of the Directive 2001/83, which I referred to at the start of the presentation, with the responsibilities for that individual defined in Article 51. Once again, we have, as I showed you on the webpage, we have a dedicated guideline for the QP, which is Annex 16, which outlines, I guess, batch testing and release of products manufactured in the European Union or the EEA, batch testing and release of products imported from third countries, and then release of products imported from a third country which is an MRA partner. And the routine duties of the QP are specified in Section 8 of this document. I'm not going to go through them, but I just want to show you how clearly they are defined. And sometimes on inspection, these are very heavily focused on, and the QP duties are extensively reviewed. So really, I guess the take-home message is just really over the next 2 slides. There are detailed guidelines available for manufacturing of medicines for human or veterinary use. The question any small and medium enterprise needs to ask itself is, do we have the knowledge to be able to interpret these detailed guidelines? Is specialist knowledge required? That's something that you may need to consider. Do we have a qualified person? Is that qualified person capable of also giving us the detailed manufacturing knowledge that we may require, and in some cases that can occur. If you are thinking of, I guess, manufacturing medicines, which I guess most of you are, early contact with your medicinal product competent authority is essential if you're trying to transition from a laboratory or an early clinical setting to putting a product into a human or an animal. So the earlier you make contact, the better. It can certainly speed your transition through the manufacturing, receiving or applying and receiving a manufacturing authorization. Seek their advice. Many medicinal product competent authorities are only too happy to give advice in relation to a manufacturing facility that you propose to build. So they will often review plans on site, or else you can go into the offices of your competent authority and have a walk through the plans of your new facility or a facility that you're developing. So use that advice. The contact should be ongoing. So once you make contact, make sure you're giving the competent authority a heads up as to when you're going to be making your application for a manufacturing authorization. And it does take time from application to award of a manufacturing import authorization. It can take anywhere from probably 12 months at the quickest up to 7 or 8 years. So please bear that in mind. It is important to ensure that you have contact and using the advice that you are receiving from the competent authority. Thank you.